Okay, today's our notes on eclipses. Now, eclipses, the Earth and the Moon don't create their own light. They're lit by the sun, so they cast shadows into space. Those shadows get cast onto another object. That's what I wrote here. When a shadow is cast onto an object, this creates an eclipse. Okay. The best way to explain it to you is that whatever is being blocked out, whatever you're not seeing anymore, is what we call the eclipse. Okay. We'll get into that in a minute. But it's that shadow. Well, the shadows, you have an umbra. That's an area of total darkness. That is casting an entire dark shadow onto that object. Now, there's another one I wrote on here. It's a noticeable eclipse because there is a penumbral eclipse, which the penumbral eclipse, people don't really understand it that well because it really doesn't look like an eclipse at all because it's just kind of slightly shaded. Now, I want you guys to kind of notice. You can see as I move around here, see that how you can see a line right there that's kind of a shadow? That right here is not shadowed at all, but then you got a little bit of a shadow here. And as I move, you can kind of see that line kind of move across. Now, is that a total darkness? Well, no, you can still see. So that's what the penumbra is it's just an area of partial darkness. When you see a penumbral eclipse, it almost looks like it's just kind of a hazy moon. Like if you see the moon and it's a lunar eclipse and it's a penumbral eclipse, you don't even notice that part, but it's still part of the eclipse process. Okay, it's kind of, some of the sunlight is still able to shine onto that object, but when it gets into the umbra, that's the area of total darkness, like you're under an umbrella. That's another good way to think of it. Okay, now, two other terms that I want you to make sure that you know in this unit with the moon is you got perigee and apogee. Now, we've talked about perihelion and aphelion a couple of units ago. That was heli is the sun, while G is talking about the Earth and the moon. Okay, so perigee is when the moon is closest to the Earth. Okay, that's when it's going to look big. Okay, because it's so close. When the object is much closer to us, when we look at it, it looks a lot bigger. Okay, that's perigee. And apogee is when the moon is away from the Earth, and when it's away, it looks small. Okay, and that's what I wrote there. I don't know if that was smudged out before or if I just hit it now, but anyways, so now the length of the eclipse, I'll show you in a minute, but when we're at perigee, okay, when the moon is close to us, that can make the eclipse last a different amount of time than if it's at apogee, which I'll show you. Okay, now we have two types of eclipses. The first one that I want to talk about is the most common one. These happen regularly. It can happen a couple times in the span of a year or more. And but when we kind of go through a spell, we actually have a whole bunch of them. But they're lunar eclipses. That's when the moon passes into the shadow of the Earth. You're seeing the moon. It only happens during a full moon. You're seeing a full moon, and what happens is the moon passes into the shadow of the Earth. So the sun is lighting up the Earth and lighting up the moon. Typically, and I can't show this in this diagram that well, typically the moon sits a little bit above the Earth or a little bit below the Earth, so it's still always lit, creating the full moon. But if it passes right into this little cone of the Earth's shadow, that's when it's going to disappear. That's when it gets eclipsed. Lunar eclipse, the moon is getting blocked out by the shadow of the Earth. Okay, so it occurs for approximately 2 to 5 hours. Again, especially the entire eclipse, the moon can be entirely gone for a couple hours. They're really tough to sit there and watch an entire lunar eclipse because it takes so long for it to happen. But the really cool part is when you can first see the shadow of the Earth going across the moon, and then when it goes into the full heart of the shadow, it actually kind of turns this orangish color, and and it's really quite neat. And sometimes, not every time. And then it comes out of the shadow, and as it comes out of the shadow, you can see the shadow of the Earth coming off the moon, and it's pretty cool. Now, if you, and I showed you here, the shadow, that's the umbra. The penumbra is kind of an area out here where the penumbral eclipse, again, like I just told you, it's kind of fuzzy, kind of hazy. It doesn't really look like it's being eclipsed that much. Okay, now, if the moon is in perigee, the eclipse lasts longer because the moon would be over here. And so it's going to be in this shadow a bigger period there. Now, if the moon is in apogee, away from the Earth, then it's only going to be in the shadow a shorter amount of time. So it would be closer to the shorter time frame. Okay, it doesn't last as long. Okay, but a lunar eclipse only happens during a full moon phase, and the moon, since its orbit is tilted from the Earth, it has to fall right into that exact right spot. All right, a solar eclipse. Solar eclipse is when the sun disappears. Well, the sun's not really disappearing, but it's disappearing from our view because what's happening is the moon is passing in front of it to block it out, okay? And so we're not able to see the sun because the moon blocks it out. This only will happen during a new moon phase. And it, again, typically the moon passes a little bit above or a little bit below and you don't even see it. It doesn't block it out at all. But if it falls right at that right exact spot, that's when it's going to block it out. Okay, so everything has to align. And the big thing with a solar eclipse, the shadow is extremely small when you get a solar eclipse. Okay, only a very few people on the Earth can see it at one time. Okay, and if you don't happen to be at that right spot and there is a solar eclipse, you won't even know that it happened unless you watch it on the news. Okay, so the sun is being blocked by the moon, casting a shadow on the Earth. This only occurs during a new moon phase. It occurs for approximately 2 hours, but the sun is only totally blocked out for 8 minutes or less, depending on the type of eclipse. And again, because the moon can be farther away or closer, if it's closer, you get a bigger shadow on the Earth. Okay, if the moon is farther away, apogee, okay, then you're going to get the shadow might not even reach the Earth. And this is something a little bit different because if the moon is in apogee, the shadow might not even hit the Earth. And what we call that is an annular eclipse. And what happens is you have the entire sun, the whole ball of the sun, but if I use my hand here, the moon goes in front of it, but you can still see the outer edges of the sun around the moon. And with solar eclipses, don't ever watch your solar eclipse without having proper eyewear because there are special glasses that are very, very dark. I've heard of people even using welding helmets, and some welding helmets aren't even tinted enough to block out the sun's rays because it will damage your eyes. And especially because what's happening is everything's getting dark around you, so it causes your pupils to open up more, and I think that it helps add to the damage that can happen to your eye. So make sure that if you ever watch a solar eclipse, lunar eclipses you can watch perfectly fine because you can look at the full moon and a full moon and it doesn't affect your eyes. Okay, but solar eclipses, make sure you have the proper eyewear if you ever get a chance to see one. Okay, and we'll be talking about it in class where you can see one. There actually will be one eventually for us to be able to see. As long as it's a clear, sunny day, we'll be able to see it. If it happens to be clouds that day, we won't see it here. But anyways, an annular eclipse is when it isn't totally blacked out and you see a little bit of a ring all the way around the sun. Okay? So, right there's a little bit to do with eclipses. Like I said, we'll talk about them a little bit more in class.